Betting, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Bet with the Best podcast. Its mission is to explore better ways to bet on races, to seek out new, successful players, and to boldly go where no podcast has gone before. The Bet with the Best podcast is sponsored by Amwager, an ADW built by horse players for horse players. Speed, power, and ease of use are at the core of Amwager, designed to give players the information and tools they need to quickly make anything from a simple win bet to a complex, structured superfecta or pick 5 wager. When you combine that with data and pool updates that are up to 60 times faster than the competition, Amwager is the clear winner in wagering on races online. Those are just a few of the many special features that Amwager has to offer, along with live video and race replays, free, integrated form-to-win past performance information, conditional wagering, and true odds, which are a prediction of off odds based on all available pool data. That and much more. Amwager is licensed and operated in the U.S., and best of all, they will actually pay you to play. If you sign up now and deposit and bet $150, you will earn a $150 lump sum bonus. So there is no reason not to give Amwager a try. If you want to bet with the best, then you need the best tools to wager with. You need Amwager. Welcome to episode 33 of the Bet with the Best podcast, sponsored by Amwager. Joining us is computer model player Keith Bush to talk in depth about handicapping and betting on races from Hong Kong. Welcome to the show, Keith. What's up?
Thanks, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm excited to talk about two things with you in some depth. One is just how you approach things as a computer modeler. I know that's something that many of the players out there aren't familiar with. And then also how and why you made this shift to Hong Kong over the last year or two, and learn more about how that's gone and try to teach the listeners a little bit about Hong Kong racing and how they might want to get started if they're interested. So before we get into that, you've heard the podcast before, and you know that I like to start with what I call the Horseplayer origin story, where you talk about how you got started in this crazy game and how that led to where you are today. So why don't you share with the listeners your Horseplayer origin story?
Sure, thanks. I started essentially during COVID back in 2020. So my background is I was a scientist. I was a faculty member of the University of Arkansas Medical School, and I worked in brain imaging, doing machine learning and brain imaging for mental health analysis studies. And during COVID, all the human subject research was shut down because of restrictions. So I had a lot of time, free time, which isn't normal when you're a faculty member, and just sitting on the couch watching Netflix movies for days on end, like everybody was doing back then. And it just popped into my head one night. I was bored. I had nothing to do, and I thought, I've always, in the back of my head, thought I would probably be pretty good at horse racing. It kind of fits my skill set pretty well, and I didn't really know anything about it. I'd been to 2 tracks in my life. I went to Santa Anita in 2005, 2006 with a friend that lived out there. And then I went to Oakland a couple of times just because I live in Little Rock, it's an hour away, but never took it really seriously. But just one day it popped in my head, I'm going to do this. I'm going to learn about it. It interests me. And so that night I went on Amazon and bought the Davidovich book I'd heard of, for my friend that lives in California that's kind of interested in horses. And then, Amazon suggests all these other books. So I just started buying the Buyer book, and then the Speed. And then his follow-up books and that recommends all these other texts to you. And I just went through and got them all. And I have a bookshelf with all the classic texts in my house. And I read all the books. I'm an academic, so that's kind of the first thing you do when you approach any problem is you read the literature. So I read everything that was available, at least at the superficial level, and I learned about other deeper texts that are more modeling related. But learn the basics. And once I had kind of understood the basics, I started listening to podcasts. That was another entry point. Think about how this went. So I read the books. I realized there was probably a social media community. Got on Twitter, lurked around Twitter for a while. I think the first podcast I found was Jason Beam's podcast, your podcast, the Sport of Kings podcast with Scott, and various other ones. And just had this collection. I just started listening to podcasts. Taking notes while I was listening to podcasts because the jargon was unfamiliar. And I realized for a long time, months even, I could not automatically parse what was a vertical versus a horizontal wager. I just couldn't understand it. Like I had to stop and I would go to this document I was keeping of terminology, look it up. Okay, horizontal means multi-race, vertical means intra-race, and okay, keep going. It's that confusing. Even, I have a lot of skills that would be useful for horse racing, but just the jargon is very thick, and people talk very fast. Typically, when they're people that kind of the public face of horse racing, they talk to the audience, not outsiders. And so I spent maybe a couple of months reading, learning, listening to podcasts. I started watching the Horseplayer TV show. So I learned a lot of the faces that are still around today. And then the biggest challenge was finding data. I realized pretty early on that data is not easy to get, and the kind of data that I would need to build a computer model, because my intention when I started was always to do computer modeling. I wasn't planning on being a traditional handicapper, paper and pencil circling on the form. That's just not the way my brain works. It never has worked that way. I find doing puzzles by hand tedious. I've always gravitated towards like meta solutions where I don't want to solve puzzles for fun. I want to solve the algorithm that solves all the puzzles. So my intention was always, how do I build the meta solver where I can just automatically handicap every card with data and bet automatically? That was always the plan. I didn't know at the time that was common. I assumed it was common, but I didn't know at the time it was common. And that's where I started. So I searched around for data. And I believe I came across some Hong Kong data early on that was freely available, but I wanted to bet U.S. racing. And I don't remember the reason for that. I was kind of gravitating towards the U.S. racing rather than Hong Kong. And then I stumbled across Brisnet data, and they sold. The reason I gravitated towards Brisnet was they sold individual cards as data files. And the reason that was important was because I could bound how much money I was going to spend to learn if there was signal in the data. So I could buy like $100 worth of data, that's like 50 cards, and the results files that you need to kind of match up the analysis you're going to do on the features versus the actual outcomes of the race. And so I bought some data from Brisnet, figured out how it works, figured out, again, matching the terminology with this growing list of terms and definitions I was learning at the time. And then I kind of busted out my skill set, which is, like I use Python primarily for modeling, some R, but mostly Python. And I just started consuming the data, looking at it, plotting various features, trying to see what's there, how it works, what it looks like, how it corrupts the data. And so that's a pretty long description, but essentially from, let's say, October. So I remember the day, it was like October 20th, 1990, and just a couple of weeks before Breeders' Cup that year, or 2020, not 2020. And then my first model was finished just before the Kentucky Derby, 2021. So like the first bet I ever made using a model was the Kentucky Derby. And I bet Helium in that race, who I looked up actually earlier today thinking about this. He finished 7th. He was 50-1 on the morning line. So maybe it wasn't the worst bet ever, but it wasn't very good. and that from there on, that's been the past. So kind of that was my entryway. I started doing a lot of modeling. I did a lot of morning line analysis, which is kind of how I got a little more followed on Twitter. I did some deep analysis on who was the best morning line makers and kind of show independent validated data showing that David Aragona is by far the best morning line maker in the country. And then from there, it just spiraled. A lot of people I started talking to, made some connections in the industry, and started iterating on the model and working to actually make it a model that was usable for betting that would be, if not profitable, at least competitive, like low negative single digit ROI kind of performance, which took 2 more years to achieve, honestly. I think I wasn't actually even close to decent until early 2023. So that's kind of how I made my way to being like more serious player, probably starting in 2023. It took about 1.5 years, 2 years to kind of build up to being even remotely useful.
So let's pause there for a second, and then we'll talk a little bit about how you then started moving towards Hong Kong racing. But I want to spend more time about how you kind of developed your knowledge base and your model. So first, just in terms of learning about horse racing, you said you kind of took an academic approach. You did a lot of reading. You just tried to look for all the information you could, podcasts. How did that go? And you know, if someone was going to try to do what you did back when during COVID, when you first got into this, you know, what advice would you give them on what's the best way to get up to speed and learn? First of all, just on the just about racing in general, and then about how to model this.
Yeah. So, okay, for anybody out there that wants to try what I just described, I would say don't start modeling until you really understand the data. So one of the mistakes I made was coming from a scientific background. So one of the things that is important to know about scientists is like, so we spend enormous amount of time trying to make our data capture perfect because you're trying to measure reality, and getting a truth is an extremely difficult problem, especially when no one's ever tried to discover some phenomenon before. And so data quality is so fundamental to our existence. It would never occur, at least I would say most scientists that I know, it would not occur to them to think that other data sets aren't as meticulously gathered. We also would assume that the data is extremely well characterized and described. And there's no hidden caveats in it because we want people to be able to replicate our experiments and so on. So and again, this is very naive, but in retrospect, I wish I would have known this, is there's just so many trapdoors in horse racing data to start. I was modeling for months, maybe a year before I even understood what run-up was, right? It's like, it didn't occur to me that would ever be a thing, that they don't start the timing, and it's not described anywhere. Like if you go through the text, run-up is not described. It's assumed that you know about it and are accounting for it. And if you look, it's buried in the documentation of the BRISNet data. Like if you don't know what run-up is and it's a number, you just say, I'll learn about it later. There's no like description of this is important and will impact a lot of the other measures we're reporting. So that was frustrating. In fact, I almost quit. The day I learned about run-up, I almost quit that day. Like, this is ridiculous. Who would do it this way? And can you imagine what other problems I'm going to discover? So that was extraordinarily frustrating and completely unnecessary. But again, I understand horse racing is a very old sport, and a lot of this stuff is legacy, and there's been technological challenges throughout the decades that, you know, have come and gone. But that was, for someone like me, almost a deal breaker that day. I seriously considered walking away, kind of started calculating in my head how many hundreds of hours I'd spent and how frustrating that was. Sorry, I lost my train of thought.
You're remembering how.
Yeah, the data. Yeah. Sorry. So
Yeah.
what would I go back and explain? So and that leads into this longer description. When you get to things like speed and pace figures, so if you get a data set, they're going to be in there. And again, I just assume that these are correct. And I assume that there's a very rigorous, well-defined, well-documented approach to constructing them. And again, you have to be in the game a long time to understand that there's a lot of nuance to these numbers. There are misaligned incentives for making these numbers. And I wish, going back, I would have learned how the numbers were constructed earlier, because it would have made, I think, I would have had a much easier time generating competitive models by generating my own speed figures, or at least being able to identify when numbers were problematic. So that's like a notion of data wrangling, data cleaning, but it's a much more sophisticated data wrangling where you have to understand it's not just like the data is missing or the data has the wrong number of decimal points and it couldn't be correct. There's a piece of data, the data is very well regarded, but that data point itself is probably flawed, and only an expert would be able to understand why. And that was, again, a frustration that came later. And it will feed into other kind of my interest later in Hong Kong. These things kind of all tie together, but that was definitely the data problems are an issue. Access to data is of course an issue with the price, the fact that it's not free. So to get large sums of data, you actually have to invest quite a bit of money to start out, which isn't necessarily an issue, but if you have the money, but if you don't, it's a real barrier. So those are the hurdles that are coming to mind now. It's just the understanding fundamentally the data, what it means, how it's constructed, when it could be problematic. That is not clear up front, even for someone that's very good at reading technical documentation and wanting to read technical documentation. It's just not to be had, the technical documentation you need in order to understand these nuances of the data.
So how did you eventually learn those?
Talking to people, so I started making my own figures for Hong Kong and realizing, wait a second, that is how would they, how could that possibly be the case unless they're doing something like guessing or filling in a number, or you see these numbers getting revised based on other performances. It started occurring to me that these numbers are fungible, and there's incentives for these numbers to remain, how do I want to say them, not to deviate too much over time for individual horses. There's incentives to not report data as it happened on the course exactly, but to change meta parameters like track variance in order to make the numbers fit a preconceived notion, as opposed to just objectively observing the numbers and saying, no, the horse just ran way too slow that day for its level, but all the measurements look correct and it looks like there wasn't any beam problems. It was just a bad number. And that, I think the numbers get revised to preconceived notions at a much higher rate than should be. And that's just from doing my own figures and seeing the amount of true variance that exists when you apply just rigorous formulas and don't try to do any fudging. And I'm not going to point, it's not like I'm pointing figures at any particular figure makers. It's just, that seems to be a general characteristic of speed figures, is that they are not measures. They are metrics that are developed by companies selling these things, and they're not perfect. And so you need to take them with a grain of salt or make your own.
Yeah.
Which, it's very challenging. And again, if you use a computer, it's much easier to do. But in the United States, there's so many tracks and the horses move around so much more than, like, for instance, at Hong Kong. There's multiple services per day at some tracks, so it's very hard to make variance. So I understand the challenges, but I think there's enough problems with speed figures that it's worth to be elite to make your own. And honestly, listening to your podcast, it seems to be the case that most of the elite people do it or have done it and have only backed off from doing it because they have so much built-in edge through other deep wells of knowledge about the game that they've been able to back off the workload. So I can understand, to me, that seems smart. And it helps. And for me, it really opened up understanding the game better, because I was actually understanding the game at a very superficial level initially. I was just, speed means speed. And, a higher number means the horse is faster. And what I realized, constructing the numbers, everything that goes into constructing that number, the number can tell you a lot more. It's like the process to getting to the number, you learn a lot about horse racing. And that's true of speed figures, it's true of pace figures, all the variants that go into adjusting speed figures. It's basically the game in itself. You're trying to basically boil the game down to a number. And so you really have to understand all facets of the game to get that number precise. So it's a really good tool. And rather than try to stick numbers into a machine learning model and predict, building speed figures is a very, very powerful learning tool.
Yeah, I remember several conversations with you about how to construct speed figures, and you had lots of good questions. So.
Yeah, I mean, and again, like you were very helpful, because even I went to the primary sources, and it's unclear from the primary sources. Just my dog's going a little crazy. So the primary sources, like the algorithms, aren't completely clear. So I had to iterate with you a few times on some questions I had about how to interpret the text, and then I went back and figured it out based on your guidance. So it was very helpful. But there's a lot of trapdoors in speed figures and there's big assumptions being made that may or may not be true. And so what's nice about creating your own figures is you get to create figures that have your own value, like your own understanding of the game and your own conception of what is valuable in terms of assumptions. It's
so
really
talk a little bit.
Yeah.
So just maybe talk about what are some of the speed figures that you're making now for Hong Kong. What are some of those assumptions that you've learned or developed that you've built into your figures?
So so all factors of the race are important. So obviously the time and the distance are important. The surface is important for constructing various, like all of these things, the basic, how do you construct a Beyer figure? But then there's these other pieces of the race, for instance, trip. How do you put trip into a number? How do you put the pace into a number? These are very hard problems to solve. You have to think about, if I make an assumption about pace, for instance, a classic example would be if the horses run slow early, there is no way they're going to run a fast figure. At the end, there's just no way to make up the time. You can't correct for intentionally running slowly to begin. And so you have to have a strategy for thinking about, how am I going to correct for this? Because it's an artificial reduction in the horse's total potential. And again, this becomes a philosophy of speed figure making. Are you trying to measure what the horse did on that day? Or are you trying to get at what is the horse's true potential on that day to run if they ran flat out, like a perfect trip? And so it really becomes like a philosophy where you have to make decisions. And so I take my speed figures are completely automatically generated. There's no human intervention at all. I do, I create data by hand that goes into them. And so some of that, and I'm trying to get rid of that process, but to do it, what I have, the resources I have now, I'm doing that. Things like trip adjustment, specifically. But all of the components, so everything you can think about, like if you're thinking about horse racing, there's speed, there's pace, there's trip. Those things should all be included in your construction of the figure. And if they're not, then you're missing something and the figure is not correct. The question is, it's always a time investment versus value. What is the explained value? And I think there's, unlimited resources. You put in everything. Constrained resources, you work with what you have. So, and again, I don't want to get too much into the exact sauce of how I do my figures. It's kind of, edge IP. But imagine, I guess, as an intellectual exercise, imagine all of the components of handicapping a race, and then trying to think about observing a race, how would I construct a number that I could use to adjust a speed figure in order to make that speed figure more representative of what the horse truly did? Because I really take the philosophy of measure as opposed to project. So measure what the horse did on that day. Try to measure if that horse could have somehow run by itself and was, ridden to its optimal profile throughout the distance, what would it achieve that day? And then everything else becomes a reduction in that performance. You're kind of reducing the total performance from that point. And that would be the variance. The track could be fast or slow. For instance, you think about I guess the optimal condition would be perfect trip, horse running by itself, jockeyed to a perfect profile of what its heart can take throughout the distance on a surface that was the most agreeable to running a high speed, and then back off from that. So take this optimal condition and then try to reduce back to what actually happened. But you then once you've worked back to what happens, you say, okay, this is what I have. These are all the steps I got to, so I can project to this would have been the perfect trip. Kind of if each of these horses was running a time trial, you could think about it. What horse would win if they each ran individually the distance on the exact same track that was perfect? That's how I think about it.
Yeah, and if you read Len Ragozin and Len Friedman's book, that's what Len Ragozin was trying to do, exactly what you described. Try to encapsulate one figure. He tried to measure everything, so you rather than just trying to guess at what you aren't measuring, try to figure out everything that affects the performance and adjust for that. So if you haven't read that one, that's one you should pick up, because that philosophy will resonate with what you're saying.
Great. Yeah, it's really, and again, every step along that sequence of steps has a cost and a benefit, and you can kind of order them by cost benefit, right? Like the time and the distance. You can make a pretty good ballpark of the speed figure from time and distance, right? They get you 90%, but all the money is in the last 10%, right? So you're not going to make money on a speed figure that's 90% correct. You really have to be much closer than that nowadays.
So one of the things I thought was interesting that you were doing was the way you figure out how to adjust for weight, using data from Racing Hong Kong. I don't know if that's one of the proprietary edges you don't want to share, or if you want to talk just a little bit about that, to give an example of the kind of detail and how you attack one element of that figure.
Yeah, that's pretty well established. It's just getting it correct. So, Hong Kong matters, or weight matters a lot of Hong Kong. I'm sure we'll talk about that more later. So, getting very precise weight adjustments. And this is the thing that gets, again, I hear it a lot at social media, and you read texts, and you see a lot of different numbers thrown out about corrects. A length is a fifth of a second. It's very interesting. That's just a number that sticks in everybody's head. And or how much is a pound in terms of a length, or how many pounds do you need to make up a length of distance? And what's really cool, again, this is an upside of Hong Kong, is that because of the way they organize the races to keep the horses very close together and whatnot, you can make very precise measurements of how much a pound of weight costs in terms of distance. And so that's one of the last steps But like after I adjust for all of the factors I'm adjusting for, trip and pace, the last thing I do is I peel off the weight. And so it becomes how, their carried weight. So there's a 20-pound weight range in Hong Kong of additional. So there's 115 to 135. And you can very exactly compute how many lengths a pound, or fractions of a length a pound is worth at Hong Kong. And you can get it down to confidence intervals that are like a tenth of a pound. So many pounds and so many tenths and I think it's something on the order of, I don't have the number here, it's somewhere in my parameters file, but it's like 4.4 pounds is one length at Hong Kong. So you can construct that range from using the class system at Hong Kong, where there's always a 20-pound spread from the worst to the best horse. Then you can construct the speed figures, compute the speed figures for that distribution, and then readjust for that weight, basically by the beaten lengths in that group. And it's very precise and it's very stable over time. And that factors very much into how Hong Kong runs its races, where they use weight to essentially create the world's best racing product by having very precise penalties that end up being, you can empirically show that their penalty system is almost perfect, where at a particular class level of race, if you look across the distribution of the weights, the speed figures are flat, meaning there's no variance from the lowest weight horse to the highest weight horse. So they're actually able to correctly guess the weight needs to be applied to a horse so that its speed figure outcome in expectation is identical to every other horse in the race, which is very cool.
So
like
let me No, I was just let me just provide that in layman's terms. So
okay, sorry.
Yeah, well, no, but I mean, because this is really good, because there's lots of debates. There are a lot of people in U.S. racing who say weight doesn't matter. 4 pounds doesn't matter. It doesn't make a bit of difference. You're saying, well, you know what? In Hong Kong, they really measure this precisely. And I looked at a lot of data, and I did all the statistical analysis, and guess what? Weight matters, and it's very predictable. And the people that run Hong Kong racing know this, and they've measured it, and they based on past performance of horses as they win or lose and move up and down the class ladder, they get penalized, or if they move up the class ladder, or they'll. I guess I'll let you explain it a little bit more when we talk about Hong Kong racing.
Yeah,
basically, they're assigning weights based on the horse's performance, and they're trying to set it up so that if this horse runs to its ability, the horse carrying 5 more pounds than another horse, because of that extra weight, that horse now should finish in a dead heat with that horse if everything went swimmingly for both of them.
Correct. Yeah.
And the whole field is like that.
A horse. Yeah. Right. They project this horse is, let's say, a length better than this other horse. That horse then is assigned. The number is in the low 4. I'd have to look it up, and I don't want to dig into my files to find exactly what I computed. But they would assign that weight to try to make those two horses in expectation run a dead heat, and that's the goal at Hong Kong. Is they really want like a blanket finish in every race. That's their goal. It seems to be to build a product where all 14 horses hit the wire at the same time every race.
If they all had equal trips, but the idea being
if they all had,
they all have a shot to win, and I think a good point to make based on that is if you did not make your adjustment for weight, and let's say that wasn't one of the factors in your speed figures, then you're going to have horses carrying more weight that are going to look like, it's going to throw off your figures, because there's going to be this unknown information that if you adjusted for weight, it would make a lot more sense, and you'd come up with a different track variant, let's say, than if you don't. And so if you don't account for all these figures, it corrupts your figures over time. And you have these built-in errors that are going to cause some drift over time as you do these numbers. So that's why you're trying to figure out, well, what are all the the materially relevant factors that I need to account for to get me as accurately, as accurate assessment of the performance as possible. That's what you're shooting for.
100% correct. I'm trying to, basically remove all of the factors outside of the horse's, potential on that day to run, in like the most perfect way possible. Exactly. And so, every little problem deviates from that and creates it. So it's harder over time. It's not that particular race is the problem. It's that those performances are then used to compute other performances in the set of speed figures, right? Like you have to use past performances to project the speed forward, like the expected speeds, in order to construct variance correctly. So it's like, once it gets in, it corrupts. It's like a fly in the soup, right? Like once it's in, it ruins the whole soup. You got to get it all out.
Yeah, and you're trying to say, like, here, I look at this horse and he carried 5 more pounds than the rest of the field, so I got to adjust for that. He was 3 paths wide on both turns. I got to adjust for that. He had to stop and regather himself in mid stretch. I got to correct. And you're trying to correct for all those things, not just by saying, you know what, I need to upgrade this horse or downgrade. You're trying to say how much precisely did that affect the performance and build that into a figure.
Right. And some of that stuff is extremely hard. And I think, there's going to be another revolution in speed figure making if people aren't already doing it, like the CAW teams or whatever, where they use, like AI scanning a video to make very precise measures of like change in momentum, right? Like those are very hard things to do by eye to measure. But you could do it with like object tracking and video, making very precise measures of how the trip, reduce the horse's overall potential in that race. Yeah. And I would love to get to that. Again, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, that's probably way too far down the rabbit hole on that, but some people will be interested in it. Sure. But let's move just a little more on the modeling. So sure. What are you modeling? Like, what are the main inputs to your model? What comes out of it? How do you use that to bet? Kind of give us, without being too for people that aren't computer savvy. Yeah.
Yeah, I always tend to be a little too academic here. So let me. I gotta preface this a couple ways. One is that the way I'm modeling now has completely shifted from how I was modeling a year ago, and there's reasons for that. So let me kind of give you a background, like a meta level view of modeling, and then how different models can be appropriate for different domains. So the basic idea of a mathematical model or mathematical computer model, and let's focus specifically on racing. So there's 2 kinds of models really that you have to think about. There's what we call like an inferential model. An inferential model is a model that's designed to understand how a system works. So you can it's a model where you can reason about it. And these simplify, it's a simplification of reality where you have these different components, and all these components interact with ways that are understood, and you use these different interactions to kind of understand what are the causes of, what if A, B, and C happen? What's the result of that? So that's an inferential model. That to understand. And then there's a second kind of modeling, computer model, which is a predictive model. And a predictive model is completely uninterested in how a system works. It is only interested in creating the most accurate prediction of data that it has never seen before, that's sampled from the same distribution of data on which it's trained. And that's pretty nerdy, but it's basically like, how they warn you with stocks, like past performances don't predict future successes. Well, the whole point of the predictive model is the exact opposite. Is if the world behaves like the world has behaved in the past, we think about the patterns of the way the world works, and races, horse racing is a very good example of this because, there's patterns to races, there's types of races, there's types of paces and pace setups and whatnot. And so, no 2 races are identical, but they rhyme, and these very well defined, people talk about this all the time on podcasts, is there's structure to races that unfold, like a meltdown, right? That's a type of race. So predictive models are only interested in extracting these patterns from data. And they do it on their own. You don't tell the model how to do this. There are statistical methods that are deployed by machine learning to automatically extract these characteristic patterns of data and then use those characteristic patterns to predict the outcomes of novel, let's say, races that it's never seen before, that aren't in the training set. So when novel race is coming up, based on the numbers of the horses involved in this race, there's going to be a pattern, and that pattern implies some outcome. And so those are the two kinds of models. And so speed figures are really an inferential model because there's like first principles involved in how all these pieces interact. And you're basically trying to understand the interaction and construct a representation of the world that is grounded in all these factors. However, speed figure models can also be predictive. So it's two ways. You can use an inferential model to predict, but its sole purpose is not to predict. Whereas a predictive model has no other purpose other than to make a prediction. And in fact, the way it represents the world internally might be very different than what, like how, let's say, experts in a field might represent the system. Machine learning models can come up with their own unique representations that are just as accurate at predicting outcomes. So that's the flavors of models. Was that too academic, or does that make?
No, that's fine. So now talk about,
Okay.
You said you kind of changed your approach, and
Right.
and then maybe sort of like what are some of the main inputs into the model, and like what comes out and how you use it.
Sure. So when I first started, I was taking a pure predictive modeling machine learning approach where I didn't know anything about horse racing. And, the point of machine learning is that you don't need to know anything about a domain, really. If the data is good quality, you sample enough of it and you stick it into these really powerful algorithms, they will spit out accurate predictions. And the goal of the machine learning expert is really just to, this is pretty academic, but there's like ways to evaluate whether or not you've sampled enough data. What is the upper bound of the potential of the model? You can detect like the upper bounds of the potentials of the models based on tests and whatnot. So our job is to kind of monitor the algorithm while it's consuming data and learning, not necessarily tell it what to do. So I decided to take that approach when I first got into the game. And so I just try to get my hands on as much data as possible. And I built that's what I call my Equus model. People follow me on Twitter, the Equus model is a pure machine learning black box model, essentially. And what it's trying to do is it consumes past performance data. So like the numerical representations of a race, like what was the morning line for that horse? How many wins did that horse have? How many starts did that horse have? What was its highest buyer speed figure, for example, right? So you take a start of a horse and you represent all of the possible things you could know about that horse as numbers. And some things are textual, like the track, right, is a text representation, like AQU is aqueducts, right? So you have to turn that text into a number as well. And there's techniques for doing this called encoding. And so what you end up with when you're trying to represent a race is for each horse, you're going to have this long string of numbers representing everything you possibly know about the horse, where the horse has been, what it's run in the past, where it's worked out, horses it's run against, all kinds of things. You're trying to represent all that. And then for a race, you bundle all those horses together into an even longer string of numbers, and you stuff it into a model. And then you tell the model, okay, this is a race. And then you show the model, this is the outcome of the race. And then the model's job is to figure out, how do I turn this long string of numbers into a probability of that outcome? And it can't know that from one example. So you give it 1 million races, 2 million races, 4 million races, right? You give it so many examples of these patterns that it figures out through adjusting its internal representation of the mapping from the feature to the target, that it can accurately, from any pattern, reconstruct the appropriate output. Typically, we output probabilities. So for instance, when I do a morning line prediction, I'm outputting the probability of the horse winning in a probability space, not an odd space. And then it's converted back to odds through conversion, where you account for takeout and whatnot. The fair odds would be the probability of the horse winning through a different training method. So morning line, you would train the horse. It's going to win on essentially the price that was paid at the window, or the tote board price of the horse at the off odds. So you're training the model to try to predict that number. Whereas the fair odds of a horse winning would be, did that horse win or not? Or did it place or not? Did it show or not? And so on and so forth. So you're giving the models different targets to optimize, to predict. And part of, target construction is very important to making good models, and to know if you train a model on a particular target, what is that model trying to say to you? And you like morning line odds are pretty easy. If you train a model to predict the off odds, the internal representation of the model is going to try to predict the probability of the horse, the implied probability of horse winning based on the tote board. That's what it's going to create. If you train it on a win-loss, it's the probability of horse winning or losing. If you train it on place loss, then it's the probability of that scenario. So target construction is very important, and that's really what you're doing. You're matching the feature of the race to the target, different models for different targets. There's some machine learning techniques where you can present all of the targets simultaneously to the model, and the internal representation of the model is actually trying to figure out a statistical representation that can solve all of them simultaneously. Those are the kinds of things. That's where the machine learning expert gets involved, is how do you build an architecture of a model that, given the data I have and the targets I have, how do I make best use of those two sets of information?
All right. So
that's,
go
ahead.
Yeah. So you have, you use your first model, you use kind of we're going to just do a predictive model. We're going to let the machine figure it out. I'm going to get as much data and scrub it as well as I can and feed it to the machine, and it's going to spit out. And then you'll have this model that can predict or estimates two things. One is what the off odds are going to be. The price will be on the horse, and then what we think the chances the horse is of winning, and you turning that into an odds. And you're going to then give it now that you train it with a bunch of data from the past, and then you say, now we'll give you the data for an upcoming race, and you tell me what you think the off odds are going to be, and what you think the price, what you think the chances of this horse are for winning, and then you're going to compare those two numbers, the predicted price, predicted chance of winning, and see if it looks like there's value there, and then bet it. Is that kind of the approach you took?
Yeah, it's the exact edge calculation it's off odds +1 times fair probability -1. So that's the edge. And I use the computer model to predict the off odds, or if you have live tote access, you just pull in the tote like what the CAWs do. But let's say you're not that sophisticated, you can estimate the edge you're going to have is off odds. Estimated off odds +1, that quantity times the fair probability -1. That's your edge. And then if you have a rebate, you'd add in the rebate it's like directly into the edge equation.
So you did this and you tested it out, and you were and you're doing US racing now, and you were on the betting side. That was when I was doing and so you're manually making bets, though. You don't have you didn't have an automated betting,
correct?
Right. Okay. And that was kind of your first Equus models.
Well, the first few were not good enough, it wasn't doing anything good. But my Equus 4 model that I turned on in February of 2023, that model was profitable. I ran it through late September 2023, so we made several thousand bets. It scanned hundreds of thousands of races. And I only, I thresholded for edge, and I basically found the juiciest opportunities and bet those. And that model was actually profitable. I just made it at the end of the year. That's right. I ran it all the way to the end of the year. I did the first validation test, like a live test, but then I ran it. And by the end of the year, December 31st, I was up 3% for the year on, probably 1 million reviewed races, and it made just a few thousand bets. And then I shut it down. And I switched to Hong Kong because I was kind of ready to move to Hong Kong and try that world. But that kind of leads into this. Hong Kong is a totally different game where.
No, hold on before you go to Hong Kong, though.
Yeah. Okay.
So
sure.
So, but you did buy your 4th generation model. It was fairly selective in terms of screening races and actually finding bets, but you were able over a pretty is it over a year? How long did you run it in that? That
it was like February to December.
All right, so almost an entire year.
Yeah.
And you actually showed a net profit, no rebates or anything.
Yeah.
3%.
No rebate was like plus
so
3. I think it was plus 3 for the year. Yeah. So that was encouraging. It wasn't,
Yeah. Well, no, that's it's really good. I mean, I imagine you put a lot of effort into that, but still, to show a profit.
Hundreds of hours.
Given that you knew nothing at all, only 3 or 4 years before, that's really impressive, at least to me. So that was sort of your I'll call phase 1 of Keith Bush becoming a horse player. Is you did all your phase 1 was kind of learning. Phase 2 was building a model and iterating. And by the end of phase 2, you'd gotten to the point where you could actually show a net profit with your model, basically applying a machine learning approach. So that kind of sum it up. And I think, did I miss anything?
Yeah,
that's want to add before we kind of move to the next part.
No, that's fair. It was again, even though I was using a model, it was exhausting because you're constantly validating. It's not like plug and play. It's really, you spend 6 months writing code testing and then you deploy it live, but then you're also updating as it's live to make sure that you've got the latest data, that it's validated up to yesterday's data. And it's a lot of work to keep a model tuned, to keep its like performance at optimum, given, as the racing seasons progress and, surfaces change. And there's a lot of things going on that cause a model to lose calibration basically and stop working. So it's exhausting. To do that. It's not easy.
So it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy, but no one ever said this was an easy game, right? But you did have some success. I mean, you could kind of claim that I created a model that showed a profit over a fairly significant period of time. And that was kind of, then it sounds like you did some reflection after that. So I'm going to pause right here for a second. And I think this will, this will be the end of part 1 of the discussion.
Okay.
Focused on the modeling part, and now in the second half, we'll go into kind of what you upon reflection, what kind of motivated you to move towards Hong Kong. And we'll really focus on that part. Okay, that concludes part 1 of today's discussion about Hong Kong racing with Keith Bush. I want to thank all the listeners out there. Please stay tuned for part 2 of the discussion next week. And until then, may you boldly go where no horse player has gone before.